What are the ramifications of the trade agreement that President Trump has just entered into with the European Union? And what are the ramifications of the sanctions that President Trump is threatening to impose on Russia? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine those two questions. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that you all know brings you the principled, uncompromising case for the libertarian philosophy, and we have for many years. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who was with the Future of Freedom Foundation in the beginning, early years of the foundation. Richard, good to see you again.
Always good to be with you and to be with our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, thank you all for tuning in. And as always, thank you very much for your great support of our work. We couldn't do it without those of you that help us out financially. And for that, we're very, very honored and very grateful. Okay, Richard, we're back to tariffs and trade wars, and that's back in the news. And it had subsided a bit, especially with all the Jeffrey Epstein scandal going on. But now it's resurfaced. Maybe that's not a coincidence. It gets people away from talking about Epstein to talking about tariffs again. So the big news is that, Trump's deadline that he had given a few months ago is coming due. I think it's August 1st, where he gave all these countries an extension of time where they were not going to have 100% tariffs or whatever the tariffs were that he was going to impose on all these countries. And I think it was about 90 countries. And he said, if they don't reach a deal within 90 days by August 1st, I'm going to go ahead with my tariff plan. And so I think it goes without saying that he has not reached a deal with all those 90 countries in 90 days. But he did reach a deal, at least tentatively, with the European Union. And so I thought, well, we ought to at least discuss that deal. At the same time, it seems that he's accelerating a deadline for Russia to end the war with Ukraine. He had given him a longer period of time to either get a ceasefire or start negotiating seriously to end the war. And he's decided to accelerate that deadline with a threat of sanctions that are either imposed on Russia or on third-party nations on Russia that deal with Russia and buy things from Russia like oil. And so here we are, back to the same old, same old. We've got tariffs and sanctions, and really, to me, they're the same thing, same principle. Uh, they destroy freedom at home. They destroy the right of people to trade with whomever they want to trade. They inflict terrible damage on people overseas. And from what I can tell, with the European Union, they finally just kind of gave in. That they finally realized that the trade war was going to be really horrific, and so they essentially gave Trump what he wanted and settled for him having his tariffs. They still have some tariffs, but I think Trump was given the so-called victory in the trade war, which is I'm sure makes him really happy. So they've agreed to something that they know is not satisfactory, and they're getting criticized for it by people in the EU. But their rationale is, well, it could have been worse if we had gone with a trade war. So what do you think about all this, Richard? What's your analysis on what's going on here at this stage of the tariff wars and the trade wars and the sanctions that President Trump is doing?
Well, I think that it reinforces and highlights once again that in spite of the rhetoric of some of his supporters, uh, Trump is once again demonstrating that he is a neo-mercantilist. He believes that for America to be strong, other countries have to be worse off. He believes that exports are good and imports are bad, which is the old mercantilist philosophy of the 1700s and the early 1800s. Uh, First of all, he is demonstrating again his attempt to be basically an arbitrary executive. So let me sort of elaborate on a few of these points. before we can have our sort of reinforcing analysis of this. First of all, he negotiated with the EU representatives out of Brussels, uh, and they were facing this August 1 deadline, as you said. And the bottom line is that the Europeans have basically said that they're going to radically reduce many of the tariffs that had been in place on American goods coming into Europe, including a variety of agricultural goods and consumer items. But the United States now will, and the European Union has accepted that there will be a general 15% import tax on European goods, EU goods entering the United States. Now, let's sort of tease this out a little bit. He had originally threatened that there would be 30% tariffs on European goods entering the United States if an agreement wasn't made. So, thanks for small favors. Americans will only pay 15% more for the goods they import rather than 30%. Thank you, Comrade Trump. Thank you, Comrade Trump. You're only going to tax us 15% more instead of 30% more. Who could ask for anything more? That's compared to the fact that before Trump's arrival and the arbitrary institution of actual tariffs or threats of them, uh, most American import taxes on European goods, with some exceptions, was around 3 or 4% at the most, some cases 2.5%. All those are now going to be far more expensive. He has refused to establish that 15% tariff rule for steel and aluminum. That is still standing at 50% of European imports of those two products. And furthermore, he's not only imposing a tax on those goods entering the country, but he's demonstrating that he believes in government-imposed import quotas. Because how is this going to work? Well, there's a certain amount of European steel and aluminum that have been coming into the US. I don't remember the tonnage, the quantity tonnage right now, but there was some amount that on average had been entering the United States from Europe over the last several years. What will happen is that those can enter the United States at the same import tax rates prior to these threats. But if there's an attempt to import into the United States any amount higher than these recent historical levels, then they get hit with a 50% import tax. Now, he believes that, oh, the Europeans or others will want to build steel and manufacture aluminum in the United States, and you're behind the tariff wall. But the fact is that this doesn't change the fact that that what's going to happen, at least in the short run, the medium run, I would argue the long run as well, that the cost of all products that are currently manufactured with steel and aluminum will significantly rise in price because of this, as well as all of those goods coming from Europe that will now have these 15% tariff rates. Now, there's a certain goods of a certain dollar amount of about $70 billion that will be allowed to flow back and forth at radically lower levels because Trump views it in America's interest to allow that. But notice the mindset here. I'm the president of the United States. I am a democratic despot. I've been elected with a majority. My party holds both houses of Congress. Therefore, I've been elected to do the will of the American people, and they elected me to impose these tariffs to protect America from these evil foreign imports. And using an emergency power, I am now acting as the arbiter of how much, when, on whom, and for how long. And the Europeans are just going along with this because they were afraid that what if he imposed the 30%? And then many of the Europeans in the EU said, well, you can't allow him to do that. We have to teach him a lesson with counter tariffs of similar comparable amounts. And the Europeans basically blinked first because that was viewed as harming themselves far more than the United States. So they've caved in this way. The other thing that should be pointed out about this executive authority there's no agreement, written agreement or treaty. This hasn't been some tariff or other treaty type relationship with the government where where oh, in which there's an agreement. What's affected? It's in law. It has been passed by Congress. This is just his authority with no details in it. And nor have the Europeans signed a document. So what if Trump decides to change his mind tomorrow or 3 weeks from now or next year? Or what if the Europeans do it the same? Because the Europeans are under pressure from their members. This has been the European bureaucracy in Brussels. But already there's heat from the French. What do you mean? What do you mean you're going to allow American agricultural goods to compete in France at low prices? Huh? What about the farmers? And the French agricultural sector is highly influential. They get subsidies from the French government and general EU redistributions as well, because they have their vested interests. So this is an agreement with no detail other than these broad outlines. No treaty or agreement documents that have been ratified by a European Parliament or the US Congress, and is basically up to the arbitrary will and decision making of the President of the United States when we don't know what's going to happen to them. Why do I say that? First, there are court cases that are now being pursued by groups of small businessmen who are saying that this is an illegitimate use of the emergency power, which is generating a situation in which they're being harmed by an overreach of executive authority. There's also the possibility that the Democrats win the Congress in 2026. And if they have majorities, they can attempt to have legislation counteracting the president. And then the fact is, in 2028, Trump is out of office. So how can people even plan adjustments in the market, responses in the market? And there's one other element to this. Trump is also a central planner in another sense. He has dictated to the Europeans, that is the European Union bureaucracy, that part of this agreement, Europe is obligated to buy a certain amount more of fossil fuels and a variety of other goods. Now, and they've agreed to this, but who's responsible for this? Is the European Union bureaucracy now going to dictate to specific European private enterprises under our agreement with the President of the United States, you must import and buy this much more natural gas or fossil fuel at a price agreed upon by us and the United States president? But this is what this agreement is. This is the superimposition of quotas, price fixing, restrictions on imports and exports, and harms to every consumer and producer on both continents. But this is what the President of the United States has done and is doing.
Yeah, well, I think part of the problem is that the United States is such a huge geographic area, which is based on free trade, domestically free trade. We have open borders, both free movements of people and free movements of goods over this huge space that the U.S. really doesn't depend on foreign trade as much as Europe does. I don't know what the percentages are, but I would assume that much more of Europe depends on trade with the United States than the United States depends on trade from Europe, simply because of this huge geographic zone here. That, in other words, we could do more easily without them than they could without us. And I think that factored into this is that it's just not worth it to them to have this 30% tariff. And so they finally say, we might as well just go along with what he wants. Now, you and I have been arguing for open borders for since the beginning of this foundation. And we published that book in the 90s called The Case for Free Trade and Open Immigration that you and I co-edited. And we said the ideal with respect to trade is unilateral free trade. Like when they were negotiating NAFTA, we were there arguing, no, there shouldn't be any negotiations. You don't need a free trade agreement. All you got to do is just unilaterally drop your restrictions. You don't need to negotiate it with anybody. If Europe wants a 30% tariff, make your tariff zero. Don't engage in that. Why? Because a tariff is just a tax. It's a sales tax. If Europe is taxing its citizens by 30% when they buy an article of something from the United States, okay, that's not good. But we don't retaliate by imposing a tax on Americans buying goods from Europe. We just keep thinking at some point the European people will figure out that what's going on here. And so one of the most fascinating agreements that I've seen in this whole process is with Vietnam. Is Vietnam, as you know, is a communist regime run by a communist regime. But early on, when all this happened, they came out with an announcement that said, "We're willing to abolish all our tariffs if you'll abolish your tariffs." So they really were calling out Trump because there were people saying, "Oh, he's Trump's just using this as a negotiating tool." All these threats, high tariffs and stuff. So Vietnam was calling the bluff, if that's what it was. Well, as it turned out in this trade agreement, Vietnam, it's very interesting, Richard, that they have no tariffs on goods from the United States. But the United States has, I don't know, a 15% tariff, whatever it is, on Vietnam. So in Trump's mind, he has won the trade war against Vietnam. It's fascinating because we have a tariff. We've imposed a tax on the American people on goods purchased from Vietnam, and they can't tax our people under this agreement. So in his mind, this trade war has been won by the United States or by him. That is really weird. It's really weird.
That's because you see, he doesn't view it as a tax on the American people. It's it's the Vietnamese, it's the European Union sellers who pay the tax to put their goods in the United States. He doesn't understand that when a European good or any foreign good comes to a port of entry and is unloaded on the docks, and the American wholesaler comes to take it away, he doesn't leave that dock until he has turned over the paperwork to prove that that import is something he's purchased and pays the duty to take it out off the facility and to remove it. In other words, it is the wholesaler, it is the American importer who pays that tax. The Europeans don't. The Vietnamese don't. Now, the fact that our importer has to pay that tax to bring the goods literally back into the United States reduces the demand for those Vietnamese or European goods because now the good costs more because the wholesaler will just move a large part of the cost of that onto the retailer because that's part of his cost of doing business. And therefore, at the higher prices, the American consumers may be less interested to buy those foreign versions of the product. That's the very purpose of, at a higher price, you tend to buy less. At a lower price, you tend to buy more. So yes, it will harm the Vietnamese exporters, the European exporters, but the burden falls upon the American consumers. They're the ones who will pay the higher price and have the smaller variety to choose from. It's the American consumer who will bear the brunt, or the American importer of raw materials who uses the imports for manufacturing to sell goods to Americans or to re-export to someplace else. So he doesn't, his mind, the foreign is made to pay a price to America. And all those tax revenues are here. Look, it's reducing our deficit because we're taking in tens of billions of dollars in those import taxes that they pay. No, they aren't paying. And that is not only the error in his thinking, but the perversity in his thinking that he thinks by making Americans pay more for what they want to buy, America wins, and that he's done a great deal when it's been a disastrous deal. He's making Americans poorer, both in terms of the cost of things and the variety of things.
No, you're
Now,
absolutely. Yeah,
if I
go
could
ahead.
switch to the second thing that you had mentioned, and this is these additional sanctions that he's threatening to impose on Russia. Trump from the time of the campaign last year was saying, I get president, I'll settle that Russian-Ukrainian war in 24 hours, 24 hours. Well, it's now over 6 months since he became president. And he played nice with Putin and he tried to bend over backwards and have his own little tantrum with Zelensky in the Oval Office. all trying to show, oh, I understand. I'm sympathetic to Putin, blah, blah, blah. And Putin, he has his own agenda. He like a broken record. He repeats his thing. There are core reasons for this war. The core issues. No entry, no participation in NATO, no participation in the EU, disarming Ukraine, getting rid of the neo-Nazis, which means the current government, and the historical recognition that Ukraine really is a part of the greater linguistic and cultural part of Russia. And like a parrot, he and his secretary, his minister of foreign affairs, just repeats this over and over and over again. He is not moved, and he's not going to be moved as long as he thinks that he can win this war. So now Trump is upset. He talks nice on the phone. I have great conversations with him. And then he drops more bomb on Kiev. I guess he's not going to play nice box with me. So what does Trump now say? I am now threatening. I gave a 50-day window, but I've narrowed it now to about 10 to 12 days. If he doesn't show that he's going to enter into a ceasefire or serious negotiations with the Ukrainians, I'm imposing additional sanctions on Russia. But on who? There's nothing more he can really sanction that the Russians sell in the United States. So what he's now threatening is to impose sanctions on third countries who buy Russian oil. And by how much? The figure that he's floated around is 100% tariffs on the goods of the countries that buy things like oil from Russia. That is, those countries now have 100% tariff imposed upon their exports to the United States. Blanket statement. Now, that would be disastrous. It's bad enough that we have these 15% or 11% tariffs with these countries that U.S. has been negotiating with under this Trump model. But 100%, this will be disastrous both for the United States and many parts of the rest of the world. And by the way, nobody takes him seriously because he played that same thing about Venezuela a few months ago. He said, we're going to impose these secondary tariffs on countries that buy Venezuelan oil. Well, you know what the result was? The Chinese imported even more oil from Venezuela than they had been before, with no negative consequences. So nobody, at least right now, is taking seriously that Trump is saying that another 10, 12 days, he's going to do something like that on anyone who trades with Russia. Now, if he does, that will make oil prices skyrocket around the world because that will be an attempt to cut off oil going to many parts of the world from Russia. So global supply of oil would be reduced. The last thing Trump wants is for American consumers, including his MAGA people, to go to the pump and suddenly find that gasoline costs $1 more a gallon. So he in fact makes himself a laughingstock in the rest of the world, a paper tiger, and if he imposes it, a disaster on the very people upon whose support he is dependent here at home.
So you're saying that the way these sanctions are going to work, that if, say, he enters into this trade agreement with the European Union, but if the Europe that provides, let's say, 15% tariffs, but if the European Union buys oil or some company within the European Union, some private company buys oil from Russia, that agreement will then be called off by Trump, and Trump will impose a 100% tariff on the EU at that point?
In principle, that could be the way. Now, certain countries in Europe already have waivers. Russian oil comes to Slovakia and Hungary. And even though Europe has these sanctions against Russian oil, they make these waivers. Now, will Trump now override his own agreement now about the 15% tariffs on EU goods and raise it to 100? There's no answer to that. But what he's talking about are countries like India or Japan, okay, or China itself, okay? Would he now impose a 100% tariff on India, a 100% tariff on China when he's trying to make a deal with China right now? And he's just tried to make a deal with Japan with a lot of details still fuzzy. Is he going to impose a 100% tariff on Japanese goods entering the United States. This is the bind his rhetoric has gotten him into.
Yeah, it sounds to me like he's just digging himself a deeper hole.
Correct.
And, I don't think
Because
he
he thinks
real.
that he is so powerful. America is so important in the world that one word from him sends a chill of fear down everyone's spine.
Well, the other factor of this, and we've talked about this in the past, but it really does need to be emphasized that he is doing this all on his own
Yes,
without specific congressional permission. This
yes,
is all by executive decree. I mean, this is the perfect example of an authoritarian ruler.
yes,
One that, ordinarily that's what you have a legislative branch of government for,
yes,
where the legislature enacts the law,
yes,
like a tariff law, and
yes,
then the president carries it out.
yes.
He is both the legislature and the president here. He doesn't need a legislature.
No,
He's just saying, I'm going to impose these sanctions. I don't need to ask for congressional permission. I'm
because
the president.
because he says he has congressional permission through those emergency powers that date from the 1970s.
Yeah. Then all he has to do is declare an emergency, whether there's an emergency or not.
Correct. He's
That, that,
defining what is an emergency,
right, right.
and that
Oh,
imports are a national security risk.
right. And of course, nobody raises the issue of whether even the delegation of that kind of power by Congress is constitutional. Because
And
I would argue,
indirectly, these lawsuits that have now started in the lower courts by groups of small American businessmen claiming that they are being arbitrarily harmed by the imposition of tariffs that he has assumed he can rightfully do under an emergency act that they say has never been used in this way and can't be justified as a national emergency in the way he is.
yeah, I think one group is that guy Volek, the law professor. They have a site called the Volek Conspiracy that
Mhm.
consists of these free market libertarian lawyers,
Right,
and they file suit. In fact, it was a kind of funny story there that the guy, the professor, I think it was Volek himself. He's a professor and he had never tried a case before. He's a law professor, and this was like his first case that he
right,
took on, and he won it. He,
right,
he argued it on these grounds that what he's doing is unconstitutional. I
right,
think the judgment has been stayed while the government appeals, but
right.
uh, it's just an atrocious system, Richard. I mean, I really thought that the world was really moving toward free trade. That there was this consensus toward free trade, and maybe there is, but Trump comes along and just totally upends this entire order that I think was moving toward free trade. They may call it free trade agreements or whatever. It's not our ideal, but it was very low tariffs. If you, as you pointed out, what 2.5% on average or so. I mean, it's just a minor sales tax.
Yes,
Uh,
this has been the world network of trade has been upended, either literally or under threat by the arbitrary actions of one man who sits in the Oval Office.
yeah, and in the process contributes to the destruction of the economic liberty of the American people. That's the
Absolutely.
thing we got to keep in mind here is that this is our freedom at stake here. It's not just our well-being, our economic well-being. It's our very freedom, the right to buy and sell with whomever you want to buy and sell. This is what Jefferson was talking about when he said life and liberty in the pursuit of happiness. He encompassed the idea of economic liberty and freedom of trade and freedom of movement and freedom of travel. Uh, and yet here we are, Richard.
Right. These are all infringements on that more broader umbrella of all that you talked about is freedom of association.
Right. All right. On that bright note, we will continue advocating free trade as well as other aspects of liberty. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoyed the visit with you and I look forward to talking to you next week. And thank you all again for tuning in and thank you again for your support. Richard, I'll see you next week.
Until next time.